We continue now at the top of Daf Daled Amud Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 4b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara said that Shinoi Kodesh applies to all of the avodos of a carbon. What that means is that, for example, if a person slaughters a carbon chatas as a carbanola, shalo lishma, that's Shinoi Kodesh. That's no good. That disqualifies, and that's true by all of the avodos of a carbon. And the Gemara also brought a source on the previous Amud for Shinoi Bailim by Shchita specifically. That's again if a person slaughters the carbon not for that particular owner. That's Shinoi Bailim. And so the Gemara brought that source for Shchita, but the Gemara asked, what about by the other avodos? How do we know that Shinoi Bailim applies by other avodos? And the Gemara wanted to say on the previous Amud, just like we find by Shinoi Kodesh, it's true by Shchita and it's true by all the avodos, so too when it comes by Shinoi Kodesh, the same thing. It's true by Shchita and it's true by all the avodos. But the Gemara said on the previous Amud that there are four differences, four things that are unique by Shinoi Kodesh that don't apply to Shinoi Bailim. And if that's the case, we really can't learn Shinoi Bailim from Shinoi Kodesh. And the Gemara now continues that discussion. V'alfagav detarti lav dafka. Now, even though of the four things we said on the previous Amud, two of them are not actually true, but tarti miya dafka, but the other two actually are true. There are two things really that are unique when it comes to Shinoi Kodesh. Two of the four are not exactly true that they're unique. And the Gemara now explains why two of the four are not exactly unique by Shinoi Kodesh. Because ma'ishna Shinoi Bailim. Because what's different by Shinoi Bailim? To lo have psulo begufo. One of the differences was that Shinoi Kodesh is psulo begufo, and Shinoi Bailim is not psulo begufo. But the Gemara now says, is that really true? Is Shinoi Bailim not psulo begufo? Machshava bi'almit. It's something that a disqualification by thought. That's what psulo begufo means, is that it's machshava bi'alma. You're going to say, since it's machshava bi'alma, it's not psulo begufo, because it's just a thought. But Shinoi Kodesh nami machshava bi'almahu. But Shinoi Kodesh also is just a thought, and you're calling that psulo begufo. Elakevan da'achshava pasla. Obviously, once you have this thought, that creates psulo begufo by Shinoi Kodesh. So hachanami, so by Shinoi Bailim also, kevan de'achshava pasla, once the person thinks this improper thought, Shinoi Bailim for the wrong owner, so then that disqualifies it. In other words, what the Gemara was saying is, your whole idea of saying that Shinoi Bailim is not psula begufo is because it's machshava bi'alma, but that's true by Shinoi Kodesh also, and obviously that's still considered psula begufo. So Shinoi Bailim is also psula begufo. That's not really a distinction. Reb Pinchas Bereder of Mari, and as far as the second one that's lav dafka, Reb Pinchas Bereder of Mari, according to his view, the Yamar yesh Shinoi Bailim la'achar misa. One of the distinctions was that Shinoi Kodesh applies even after the owner dies, but Shinoi Bailim does not apply after the owner dies because he already has died, and so therefore there's no concept of Shinoi Bailim offering it for a different owner. When the Yoresh, when the heir brings that carbon, there's no concept if the owner's not alive. But Reb Pinchas Bereder of Mari actually says, no, there is a concept of Shinoi Bailim la'achar misa, does exist, and so therefore that pircha, that distinction also is not true. But still, the Gemara says, Tarti miya ikol mifrach, but the other two distinctions that we said in the previous Amud, those refutations apply, and so in any case, we're back to our question, how do you know Shinoi Bailim applies by the other avodos? And so the Gemara continues and answers, Elo Amar Ravashi, rather Ravashi says, Amar Krutz, because the Pasuk says, V'nir tzalo l'chaper olav, and V'nir tzalo l'chaper olav is referring to Zurika, and we learn from there, V'lo al chaveiro, it has to be that you're doing the Zurika Sadam for the owner, and not for his friend, and so there you see an idea of Shinoi Bailim, when it comes at least to Zurika. Rashi explains, l'chaper olav to be a kapara for him, Hainu Zurika, the kapara is the Zurika, the throwing of the blood is the atonement, Alma Zurika l'shem Bailim, boy, you see that Zurika needs to be for the Bailam, so we at least have a source for Zurika. But the Gemara says, V'hai l'hachi udasa, but can we really use this pasuk, V'nir tzalo l'chaper olav, can we really use it for Shinoi Bailam by Zurika? Hai mi boile l'cheretanya, it's needed for what we learn in the following Brisa. The Brisa says, V'nir tzalo l'chaper olav, quotes the exact same pasuk. Rabbi Shimon says, this pasuk teaches us, es sha'olav, something that is olav, chaye b'achriyusa. So then the owner is responsible, let's say something should happen to the animal, he's going to have to bring another animal. That's a way of saying that a neder, the owner is responsible, let's say something happens to the animal, to bring another one. V'yes she'eno olav, but if it's not olav, so eno chaye b'achriyusa. So that's another way of saying that by an edava, where you say this animal is a carbon, so if something happens to the animal, you don't need to bring another animal in that situation. So that's what we learn out from V'nir tzalo l'chaper olav. V'yamar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, and Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says, my time, what's the reason? Kevan damar olai, since by a neder you say hare olai, it's upon me, commanded ton le akaspe dami, it's like he's putting it on his shoulders. So in any case, that's what we learn from V'nir tzalo l'chaper olav. So how can you say we learn Shinoi Bailim by Zrika? And the Gemara continues and answers, Ravashi mi v'nir tzalo l'chaper ka amar. Ravashi is learning from v'nir tzalo l'chaper, meaning to say we really can learn out both ideas from v'nir tzalo l'chaper olav. And Rashi explains, Es sha'olav kegon neder. Olav means it's like a neder. Diamar hare olai, he says, upon me. That's the idea of olav. Ola chayev b'achar yuso. He says, hare olai ola, upon me is an ola. So then he's chayev b'achar yuso, meaning him hifrish behemel nidro. If he separates an animal to fulfill his vow, in meso nignava, if it dies or it's stolen, so he's going to have to bring another one. Dahachi mashma oso sha'olav. That's what it means when it says v'nir tzalo l'chaper olav. It means oso sha'olav yakrav oso v'nir tzalo. That person who the obligation is upon him has to bring it. V'yad shiakrivenu, until he brings it, lo nir tzavalo niftar. So it's not accepted, and he doesn't exempt himself. But as she'eno olav, but if it's not olav, kagon damar harezu ola, like he says, this animal is an ola. So then again, there's no achrayas in that case. And the Gemara then answered, mi v'nir tzalo l'chaper ka'amar. Rav Ashi is learning from v'nir tzalo l'chaper, meaning dahachi mashma, meaning it's understood lo l'chaper. To him it's a kapara, v'lo l'chavero, and not to his friend. So that's what Rav Ashi is learning out from. But again, when it comes to the limud of the brisa of v'nir tzalo l'chaper olav, there really it's idea of l'chaper olav. It says olav es sha'olav hare olai. That was learned from a different part of the pasuk. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Eshkechan Zvicha Uzrika. We now have sources by slaughtering and by the throwing of the blood, the sources for Shinoi Bailim, that's considered problematic and disqualifies. But Kabbalah Minol, and what about by the receiving of the blood? How do we know there's an idea of Shinoi Bailim? V'chitema Leilef mi Zvicha Uzrika. Now maybe you'll say we should learn it out from a Tzad Hashava of Zvicha and Zrika, from a combination of slaughtering and throwing the blood. But Mal Zvicha Uzrika, what's unique by Zvicha and Zrika, Shekein Avoda Shechayovin Ale B'chutz. Those are avodos that if you do them outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so a person is chayiv if he does it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, he's liable, and therefore you cannot learn Kabbalah from them. And so the Gemara continues, Elo Amar Rav Ashi, rather Rav Ashi says, Asya Me'el Nazir, we learn it out from the ram of the Nazir. Dechsiv, because it's written by the ram of the Nazir, Ve'eso'ayel Yasa Zevach Shlamim, the Nazir, he brings a ram, and that is a Zevach Shlamim, that's a Shlamim, and Shetehei Asiyaso L'Shem Shlamim, that pasuk teaches us that you have to do it L'Shem Shlamim, that's Shinoi Kodesh, but we already know the halach of Shinoi Kodesh by Shlamim. V'meino inyan l'Shinoi Kodesh, so if you don't need it for Shinoi Kodesh, the nafkalei mehasam, we already learned it out from over there. We learned it out earlier. So Taneu inyan l'Shinoi Bailim. So instead you can apply it to Shinoi Bailim, and so now we have a concept of Shinoi Bailim in this pasuk over here. But the Gemara continues and asks, Amar le Ravacha bar Abba l'Rava. Ravacha bar Abba said to Rava, Eimo yasa klal. If you're looking at this pasuk, v'yaso ayel yasa zevach shlamim, why don't we say that the yasa is a generalization? And zevach, when it says zevach shlamim, zevach is a prat. That's talking about slaughtering. That's a specification. And so we should actually say klalu prat, ein bechlal elamasha beprat. Anytime you have a generalization followed by a specification, we only include the specification. And zvicha in midi achrin alo. And so therefore that would say that by slaughtering you have an idea of Shinoi Bailim, but that's it, and by nothing else. And so really we don't have a source over here for Kabbalah. And the Gemara says, Iksiv Yaseh Shlomim Zevach Kedokamrit. If it said Yaseh Shlomim Zevach, then you would be correct. As you said, that would be a Klalu Prat. But Hashda Iksiv Yaseh Zevach Shlomim. Here where it says Yaseh Zevach Shlomim, the Zevach is like interrupting between the Yas and the Shlomim. Havale Klal She'ino Moli. That's called a generalization that's not full, because there's a word in between. V'chol Klal She'ino Moli. Anytime you have a Klal that's not Moli, that's not full, Ein Donin Oso B'chlalu Prat. There you can't count as a klalu prat. And so therefore, in this situation, you don't really have a klalu prat. It doesn't say yasa shlomim zevach, in which case, again, that would be a klalu prat. And so therefore, you can't say it's restricted to slaughtering. But the Gemara continues, Ravina says, Liolam Danin. Actually, we do count that as a klalu prat. Yasa zevach shlamim la Hashem would count as a klalu prat. However, v'la Hashem, when it says la Hashem at the end, chazaru klal, that actually is another klal, and it's really a klal uprat uklal, and as we're going to see soon, a klal uprat uklal, there we actually can include anything similar to the prat, and that's why we're able to include Kabbalah as well. But the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravacha mi Difti le Ravina. Ravacha from Difti said to Ravina, V'halodami klola kamo le klola basra. The first klal is not really the same as the last klal, meaning when it says yase, which is a klal, and la Hashem, which is a klal, those are not similar. Because klola kamo meraba asios. Because the first klal is talking about all the essential avodos that are done with a carbon. V'sulo and nothing else. And klola basra, but the latter generalization, kol la Hashem, that should be anything that's la Hashem. That should include everything that you do with the carbon. Meaning, va'afilu shvichas shirayim, that would include even pouring out the whatever remains, va'haktaras emurin, and burning the emurim, burning that which was offered. And the shirayim here specifically refers to the remains of the blood, and again, the haktaras emurin is the burning of the sacrificial portions. And so again, the point over here is, if the klala kamo is not similar to the klala basra, you can't really do a klalu pratu klal. But the Gemara continues and answers, Hatana devei Rabbi Shmuel, it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, Bechlalu prati darish ki agavna, that actually you could darshan klalu pratu klal in such a situation. And so the Gemara continues now, klalu pratu klal, so if you say this is a klalu pratu klal, iatadana l'keina prat, you include anything that's similar to what was specified, which was slaughtering, mahaprat meforish avoda, just like the prat is something which is an avoda, uva'inon l'shmon, and it needs to be l'shmon, again talking about, it has to be for the bailim, you can't have shinoi bailim, Afkol avoda uva'inan lishma sotu. Anything that's an avoda needs to be lishman, and so we learn out the idea of shinoi bailim by all of the avodos. But the Gemara says ima haprat mefurish avoda v'chayavin oleh bachutz. But what was specified is an avoda which you're chayiv if you do it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So avkol avoda v'chayavin oleh bachutz. So it should only apply to avodos which you're chayiv if you do them outside of the mikdash, and then it would be shchita uzrika in kabbalah v'holacha lo. That would apply only to slaughtering and throwing the blood. It would not apply to Kabbalah, receiving the blood, and holacha, carrying the blood. Inami, or you might say, Mahapran mefurish davar haton safon v'yeshno bechatos apnimios, what was specified, slaughtering, that is something that requires, it needs to be done in the north, and it applies by the chatos that are brought inside the mikdash. Av kol haton safon v'yeshno bechatos apnimios, so too maybe we're only including avodos that required safon, and that apply by chatos apnimios, and according to that logic, shchita v'kabbalah in, so shchita and kabbalah would be included, but zrika lo, but zrika would not be included. And so therefore we don't know that we can include all of the avodos. And the Gemara says, well, ikol memar hachi v'ikol memar hachi, you could say this way, you could say that way. Shkul and Haim, they're all equal v'yavo shnein, and therefore they should all be included. And Rashi explains, you could say it's an avoda that you're chayiv outside the mikdash, v'yasyul zrika, that would include zrika. When you could say that we're talking about an avoda that requires north, v'yasyul kabbalah, and then kabbalah would be included. And so therefore, shkul and him, therefore they're equal. Hamidos shavas, it's all equal. V'himinayo mifkas, which one are you going to learn and which one won't you? Either rashtaha anah darishna l'idach, if you darshan this one, I'll darshan the other one. Hilkach yavo shneim, therefore include both of them. And Rashi adds, v'holach, and once we're already including Kabbalah and Zrika in addition to Shchita, so Halacha also al karchach lasifka michlal Kabbalah, Halacha should be no different than Kabbalah, and therefore we include all of the avodos in Shinoi Bailim. And the Gemara continues with a slightly different phrasing of what we just said above, Lishna Achrin, another version, V'chada chada teiko b'mil, so that each one will stand in its place. There's a slightly different gear so we have over here at the side, Shakalu, it's equal, V'chol chada v'chada teiko b'mil, so each one will stand on its own, meaning to say again, you're going to learn out Kabbalah and you'll learn out Zrika, and then you'll learn out Halacha as well. Iba is same if you want, we could say that Zrika mid Ravashi nafka, we already learned out Zrika above from Ravashi, and Rashi explains, Midar Ravashi mi venir tzelo lechaper, again from Ravashi above, from venir tzelo lechaper, uchlalu prat, and therefore the klalu pratu klal leisuya Kabbalah, that will include Kabbalah, the lezrika lo itzrich, because it's not needed for zrika. And so in any case, again, through these combinations of these different ways of learning, we learn out Shinoi Bailim by all of the avodos. But the Gemara continues and asks, Eshkechon el Nazir, so we find this by the ram of the Nazir, because that's where we're bringing the source again, that Shinoi Bailim applies by all these avodos. But Shar Shlamim and Nolan, how do you know it applies by other carbon Shlamims? V'chitema neilif me el Nazir, and if you'll say we'll learn other Shlamim from el Nazir, from the ram of a Nazir, Male el Nazir shekein yeshi moin damim acherim, but el Nazir is unique because there are other bloods, meaning the Nazir brings other karbonos, he brings a chatos and an ola as well in addition to the Shlamim. And so therefore again, who says you can learn out from Nazir to regular Shlamim? And the Gemara says, no, im kein nichtov Shlamav. If that was the case, then it should have written Shlamav. My Shlamim, why does it say Shlamim? L'rabos kol Shlamim. It includes all Shlamim. But the Gemara continues and asks, Eshkechon Shlamim. So fine, we find this by Shlamim. But Shar kol kodshim and all, and how do we know this is true? By other karbonos. And Rashi explains, Eshkechon Shlamim bein b'shinoi kodesh, bein b'shinoi bailim. The Gemara is now saying by both Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailim. Again, Shinoi Kodesh is if you have in mind a different carbon, Shinoi Bailim, you have in mind a different owner. So you find this by Shlamim. How do you know? By other karbonos. V'chitema neilif mi Shlamim. If you'll say that other karbonos should be learned from Shlamim, Mal Shlamim shekein te'unin, smicha, nesachim, utenufas chazav v'shok. But what's unique by shlamim is it requires smicha, that's leaning upon the animal, and nesachim is libations, and tenufas chazav v'shok is the waving of the chaz and the shok, the waving of the breast and the thigh, and so therefore you can't learn other karbanos from shlamim. And so the Gemara says, Ela Markra, rather it's because the pasuk says, Zos haTorah la'ola v'lamincha v'lachatos v'la'asham v'la'miluim u'lezevach hashlamim. It lists all the karbonos together. He kishan ha'kasav l'shlamim. So the pasuk is comparing them to shlamim. Ma'ashlamim bein shinoi kodesh bein shinoi bailam. Just like by shlamim, whether we're talking about shinoi kodesh, whether we're talking about shinoi bailam, bo'inan l'shma needs to be l'shma. Afkal, so too by all the other karbonos, bein shinoi kodesh, bein shinoi bailam, bo'inan l'shma. Whether we're talking about shinoi kodesh, whether we're talking about shinoi bailam, it needs to be lishma. And the Gemara continues and asks, Ema, why don't we say Hecha de shachet luhu shalo lishma, that if he slaughters the carbon shalo lishma lifsalu, that it should be totally disqualified? And again, the Mishnah said that you have cases where it's not totally disqualified, it just doesn't fulfill the obligations of the owner. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Kra, it's because the pasuk says, Motzas vasecha tishmor v'yasisa kasher nadarta. The pasuk mentions to fulfill a neder, and then at the end of the pasuk, it mentions nedava. And so the Gemara says, Hi nedava nederu. This is a nedava, it's a neder. Why are you saying nedava at the end of the pasuk and neder in the beginning? Ella, rather, what the pasuk means is as follows: Im kemasha nadarta asisa. If you do like you said, then yehei neder. Then it's a neder. Then it's a fulfillment of the oath. V'im lav, and if not, yehei nedava. Let it be a nedava, meaning to say it won't fulfill your actual obligation, but it still is a carbon. And the Gemara says, "V'itzrich motzas fasecha." It's necessary for the pasuk to teach from motzas fasecha. V'itzrich zos haTorah, and it's also necessary the pasuk of zos haTorah that we just quoted above. We need both sources. The cause of Rachmana motza, because if it only said motza, and the Bach has the gears of motzas fasecha lo yadana, if it just said motzas fasecha, I wouldn't know. And Rashi explains, Lifsalu, again, why don't we say that the carbon is totally pasul, Sharei lo nasu kilchas, and it wasn't done properly. Vein zrikasan, materis besar and lachila. We should say that the zrika of the blood, the throwing of the blood, should not allow one to eat the meat. And the Gemara then said, V'itzrich lemichtav zos haTorah lemigmar mishlamim. We need zos haTorah to learn from shlamim. V'lo teiman, don't say mi motzas fasecha nafka to lechatchila beinan l'shma, that we learn from motzas fasecha that lechatchila needs to be l'shma. You do need zos haTorah, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Hey Amud Aleph.